Social influence. In 1980, you'd have been more likely to see a woman smoking a cigar than sporting a tattoo. Back then, tattoos were rarely seen on anyone besides sailors and prison inmates. Now you wouldn't be surprised to see architects, accountants, doctors, judges, even professors with tattoos. According to a 2016 study, 3 in 10 adults have at least one tattoo. The growing popularity of tattoos over the past few decades reflects the power of social influence. The many people who paid for permanent markings on their body didn't suddenly sense the virtues of body art on their own. They influenced one another. The influence was sometimes implicit. Look at that cool arrow Jill has on her ankle, and sometimes explicit. Check out our fraternity letters on my triceps. You should get them too. Social influence takes many forms. It contributes to prison guards abusing inmates, see Chapter 1, school children failing to stop a bully, and soldiers suppressing their fear and charging into battle. Sometimes people consciously decide to copy others or comply with requests. Other times they just go along, unaware they're being influenced. The power of social influence can be seen in studies of how much people in different social networks influence each other. You are 40% more likely to suffer from obesity if a family member or friend is obese. You're also 20% more likely to be obese if a friend of your friend is obese, and 10% more likely if a friend of a friend of a friend is obese. This pattern, which seems to hold through 3 degrees of connection in social networks, has been demonstrated in studies of drinking behavior, smoking, and general levels of happiness. If a friend of your friend is happy, you're more likely to be happy too. Outline: what is social influence? Conformity, compliance, obedience to authority. This effect is partly due to shared genes and partly to what is called homophily, the tendency for people to associate disproportionately with people who are like them, see Chapter 10. However, not all these social network effects result from homophily and genetics. Some are the result of social influence. In one telling experiment, someone canvassed residents door to door and encouraged them to vote. The canvassing influenced not just the person at the door, but other household members as well. Another study examined whether participants in a game where money was at stake cooperated with one another or focused on their narrow self-interest. Everyone played many rounds of the game, with each participant randomly assigned to a different 4-person group each round. The investigators found that whether a person was altruistic on, say, round 3, had been influenced by how selfish or altruistic that person's groupmates had been on round 2. But that person was also influenced by what her round 2 groupmates had experienced with their groupmates on round 1. Because the participants were strangers randomly assigned to different groups, the results must have been due to social influence, not homophily or genetics. Thus, some types of behavior truly are contagious. The topic of social influence highlights an important theme first raised in Chapter 1. Many elements of a situation can profoundly affect behavior. In examining social influence, this chapter discusses a number of situationist classics in social psychology. Experiments that have become well known in both the field of psychology and the broader culture for revealing how seemingly inconsequential details of a social situation can have powerful effects on behavior. A social influence network. This depiction shows how happiness clusters among friends, spouses, and siblings in a sample of participants in Framingham, Massachusetts. Each point represents a participant, circles for women, squares for men, and the lines between each point represent their relationship: black for siblings, red for friends and spouses. The color of each point represents that person's happiness level: blue for the least happy participants, yellow for the most happy, and green for those in between. You can readily see that the most and least happy people cluster together. Social influence and fashion. Social influence affects what we do and say and how we present ourselves to others. A. In the 1940s, tattoos were rarely seen on anyone other than sailors and soldiers. B. C. Today, tattoos are common on both men and women. What is social influence? Social influence refers to the many ways people affect one another. It involves changes in behavior or attitudes that result from the comments, actions, or simply the presence of others. Other people routinely try to influence us. A friend's pressure to go out drinking, an advertiser's efforts to get us to adopt the latest fashion, a charity's plea for money, or the attempts of a parent, politician, or priest to shape our moral, political, or religious values. And we ourselves often try to influence others, as when we unconsciously smile at someone for actions we like, frown at someone for behavior we dislike, or deliberately try to coax a friend into doing us a favor. Effective interactions with others require knowing when to yield to their attempts to influence us and when and how to resist. Effective social interaction also demands that we exercise some skill in our own attempts to influence others. Social psychologists distinguish among several types of social influence. The most familiar form of influence is conformity, defined as changing one's behavior or beliefs in response to some real or imagined pressure from others. As noted earlier, the pressure to conform can be implicit, as when you decide to toss out your loose-fitting jeans in favor of those with a tighter cut, or vice versa, simply because other people are doing so. But conformity pressure can also be explicit, as when members of a peer group pointedly encourage one another to smoke cigarettes, try new drugs, or push the envelope on the latest extreme sport. When conformity pressure is sufficiently explicit, it blends into another type of social influence called compliance, which is when a person responds favorably to an explicit request by another person. Compliance attempts can come from people with some power over you, as when your boss asks you to run an errand, or they can come from peers, as when a classmate asks to borrow your notes. Compliance attempts from powerful people often aren't as nuanced and sophisticated as those from peers because they don't have to be. Think how much easier it would be for your professor to persuade you to loan her $20 than it would be for the person who happens to be sitting next to you in the classroom. Another type of social influence, obedience, occurs when a more powerful person, an authority figure, issues a demand rather than a request to which the less powerful person submits. Social influence, the many ways people affect one another, including changes in attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and behavior resulting from the comments, actions, or even the mere presence of others. Conformity, changing one's behavior or beliefs in response to implicit or explicit pressure, real or imagined, from others. Compliance, responding favorably to an explicit request by another person. Obedience, in an unequal power relationship, submitting to the demands of the person in authority, which are explicit. Conformity. If you went back in time to the 1930s and visited any commuter train station, you would notice a number of similarities to today's commuting scene, as well as a few obvious differences. One important similarity is that most people would keep to the right so that collisions and inconvenience are kept to a minimum, but two important differences would stand out. Nearly all the commuters in the 1930s were men, and nearly all of them wore hats. The transition from a predominantly male workforce in the 1930s to today's more gender-egalitarian workplace was the product of all sorts of social influences, many of them intentional and hard-fought. But what about the hats? Was their disappearance over the years deliberate? If so, who did the deliberating? It's hard to resist the conclusion that this trend was much more mindless, that most people simply copied the clothing choices of everyone else. Be regular and orderly in your life like a bourgeois, so that you may be violent and original in your work. Gustave Flaubert, 19th century French novelist. Is the tendency to go along with others a good thing or a bad thing? In today's Western society, which prizes autonomy and uniqueness, the word conformity seems negative to most people. If someone calls you a conformist, for instance, you probably wouldn't take it as a compliment. To be sure, some types of social influences are bad, such as going along with a crowd to pull a harmful prank or drive a vehicle while intoxicated. Other types of conformity, however, are neither good nor bad, such as conforming to the norm of wearing very loose pants, as in the 1990s, or tighter pants, as in the 2000s. Still, other types of conformity are clearly beneficial. Conformity eliminates potential conflict and makes human interaction much smoother, and it allows us not to have to think so much about every possible action. Conformity plays a big part, for example, in getting people to suppress anger, to pay taxes, to form lines at the theater, museum, and grocery store, and to stay to the right side of the sidewalk or roadway, in the United States anyway. Would any of us really want to do away with those conformist tendencies? Indeed, evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists have argued that a tendency to conform is generally beneficial. We are often well served by doing what others are doing, unless we have a good reason not to. Conformity pressures in daily life. Conformity to what others are doing can be seen in these comparative images of commuters during the 1930s and commuters today. Nearly all of the earlier commuters wore hats on their way to work, but very few do so now. Automatic mimicry. Perhaps the most subtle form of conformity is our tendency to mindlessly imitate other people's behavior and movements. It's often said that yawning and laughter are contagious, but a great deal of other behavior is contagious as well. Like it or not, we're all non-conscious copycats. We all mimic those around us. The tendency to reflexively mimic the posture, mannerisms, expressions, and other actions of those around us has been examined experimentally. In one study, undergraduates took part in 2 10-minute sessions in which each of them, along with another participant, described various photographs from popular magazines such as Newsweek and Time. The other participant was, in reality, a confederate of the experimenter, and there was a different confederate in each of the 2 sessions. The confederate in one session frequently rubbed his or her face, whereas the confederate in the other session continuously shook his or her foot. As the participant and confederate went about their business of describing the various photographs, the participant was surreptitiously videotaped. The videotapes were taken of the participants only. The confederates weren't visible on the tape, so the experimenters watching the tapes could not have been affected by knowledge of what movement, face rubbing, or foot shaking the confederates were doing. As predicted, the participants tended to mimic, conform to, the behavior exhibited by the confederate. The participants shook their feet more often in the presence of a foot-shaking confederate and rubbed their faces more often when next to a face-rubbing confederate. Figure 9.1. I don't know why, I just suddenly felt like calling. It's in a comic where everyone is calling each other. Reasons for mimicry. Why do we mindlessly copy the behavior of other people? There appear to be 2 reasons. William James, 1890, provided the first explanation by proposing his principle of ideomotor action, whereby merely thinking about a behavior makes performing that behavior more likely. Simply thinking about eating a bowl of ice cream, for example, makes us more apt to open the freezer, take out the carton, and dig in. The thought that we might type the wrong letter on the keyboard makes us more prone to typing that very letter. The principle of ideomotor action is based on the fact that the brain regions responsible for perception overlap with those responsible for action. When this principle is applied to mimicry, it means that when we see others behave in a particular way, the idea of that behavior is brought to mind, consciously or otherwise, and makes us more likely to behave that way ourselves. Ideomotor action, the phenomenon whereby merely thinking about a behavior makes performing it more likely. Figure 9.1, unconscious mimicry. This graph shows the average number of times per minute participants performed an action, face rubbing, foot shaking, while in the presence of someone performing that action or not, demonstrating that people tend to mindlessly mimic the behavior of those around them. Okay, so it's 2 sets of 2 bars. On the left hand, you have Confederate rubs face, and then you can see the participant rubs their face more than they shake their foot. And then on the right, it is Confederate shakes foot, and you can see the participant shakes their foot twice as much as they rub their face. The second reason we reflexively mimic others is to facilitate smooth, gratifying interaction and, in so doing, to foster social connection. People tend to like those who mimic them more than those who don't, even when they're unaware of being mimicked. What's more, people who have been mimicked tend to engage in more pro-social behavior intended to help others immediately afterward, such as donating money to a good cause or leaving a larger tip for the person who mimicked them. Studies have shown that our tendency to mimic others is particularly strong when we feel a need to affiliate with others and when the others in question are well liked. Mimicry seems to be a helpful first step toward goodwill and harmonious interaction. Ideomotor action and conformity. Seeing others behave in a particular way sometimes makes us non-consciously mimic their postures, facial expressions, and behavior. Before the signing of the 1995 Middle East Peace Accord, U.S. President Bill Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and King Hussein of Jordan all adjusted their ties as Yasser Arafat, who was not wearing a tie, looked on. Informational social influence and Sharif's conformity experiment. Sometimes people conform to one another a bit more consciously, as illustrated by an early conformity experiment by Muzaffar Sharif, 1936. Sharif was interested in how groups influence the behavior of individuals by shaping how reality is perceived. He noted that even our most basic perceptions are influenced by frames of reference. In the well-known Mueller-Lyer illusion, shown in Figure 9.2, for example, one vertical line appears longer than the other because of how the lines are framed by the two sets of arrows. Sharif designed his study to examine how other people can serve as a social frame of reference to change our perception of reality. Figure 9.2, the Mueller-Lyer illusion. The framing of the vertical lines by the arrows affects how the viewer perceives their lengths. Even though the two vertical lines are exactly the same length, the one on the left appears longer than the one on the right because of its outward pointing fins at the top and bottom, as opposed to the inward pointing fins at the top and bottom of the line on the right. So you can see a line, and then the ends are like stretching outward, and then on the left and then on the right you can see a line, and the lines at the ends are going inward, so it appears shorter. Sharif's experiment was built around what's called the autokinetic illusion, the sense that a stationary point of light in a completely dark environment is moving. Ancient astronomers first noted this phenomenon, which occurs because in complete darkness there are no other stimuli or frames of reference to help the viewer discern where the light is located. Perhaps, Sharif thought, other people in the same completely dark space would serve as a social frame of reference that would influence the viewer's perceptions of the light's movement. To start off, Sharif put individual participants in a darkened room alone, presented them with a stationary point of light on trial after trial, and had them estimate how far it moved each time. Some people thought on average that the light moved very little on each trial, say 2 inches, and others thought it moved a good deal more, say 8 inches. Sharif's next step was to bring several participants into the room together and have them call out their estimates. He found that people's estimates tended to converge over time. Those who individually had thought the light moved a fair amount soon lowered their estimates. Those who individually had thought the light moved very little soon raised theirs. Figure 9.3. Sharif argued that everyone's individual judgments quickly fused into a group norm, and that norm influenced how far participants reported seeing the light move. A follow-up experiment reinforced his interpretation. When participants came back for individual testing up to 1 year later, their judgments still showed the influence of their group's earlier responses. 1954. Social psychologists typically interpret the behavior of Sharif's participants to be the result of informational social influence, the reliance on other people's comments and actions as an indication of what's likely to be correct, proper, or effective. We want to be right, and the opinions of other people can be a useful source of information to draw on. Remember this concept of informational social influence, as we will soon contrast it in depth with another type of social influence. The tendency to draw on other people's comments, actions, and opinions as useful sources of information is most pronounced when we're uncertain about what is factually correct, or are in unfamiliar situations and are uncertain about how to behave. For example, we're more likely to conform to others' views on subjects we have only vague ideas about, such as macroeconomic policy, than on familiar topics, such as how much more fun it would be to vacation in northern Italy versus North Korea, and we're more likely to conform to what others are doing when we are in a foreign country than when we are in the familiar environment of our own country. Note that the task Sharif asked his participants to perform was about as ambiguous as it gets, so informational social influence was strong. The light, in fact, didn't move at all, it just appeared to move. The uncertainty of the light's movement left the participants open to the influence of others. Informational social influence, the influence of other people that results from taking their comments or actions as a source of information about what is correct, proper, or effective. Figure 9.3, Informational Social Influence. Sharif's conformity experiment used the autokinetic illusion to assess group influence. Participants' estimates tended to become more similar over time. Okay, so the bottom left of the x-axis is showing when the participants were alone, and then it goes to trials 1, 2, and 3, and the y-axis is showing the estimated movement in inches from between 0 to 8 inches. So when participants were alone, participants estimated how far the point of light appeared to move first when they were alone, and then in each other's presence. When they were together, their estimates converged. Okay, so the three participants are the three lines. So at the beginning, one person thinks it moves 1 inch, one person thinks it moves 2 inches, and the third person thinks it moves about 7.5 inches. So when they're put together, in the first trial, they all become within 1 inch of each other. In the second trial, they get even closer, and by the third trial, they have all converged on 2 inches. Normative social influence in Ash's conformity experiment. You might be wondering, what's the big deal here? It makes sense that participants conform to one another's judgments. After all, there was in fact no right answer, and participants couldn't have felt confident in their own estimates. Why not rely on others? If this is your reaction, then you're thinking just like another pioneer of conformity research, psychologist Solomon Asch. Asch thought that Sharif's experiment, although informative about a certain type of conformity, didn't address situations in which there is a clear conflict between an individual's own judgment and that of the group. Sharif's findings don't apply, for example, to the experience of knowing you've had too much to drink to drive safely, while your peers are urging you to get behind the wheel. Come on, don't be a wimp, you'll be fine. Asch predicted that in a case of clear conflict between a person's own position and the viewpoint of the group, there would be far less conformity than that observed by Sharif. He was right. The reduced rate of conformity, however, was not what made Asch's experiment one of the most famous in the history of psychology. What made his study so well known was how often participants actually did conform, even when they thought the group's viewpoint was completely crazy. In this famous experiment, Asch 1956, 8 male students were gathered together to perform a simple perceptual task, determining which of 3 lines was the same length as a target line. Figure 9.4. Each person called out his judgment publicly, one at a time. The task was so easy that the experience was uneventful, boring even at first. On the third trial, however, one participant found that his private judgment was at odds with the expressed opinions of everyone else in the group. He was the only true participant in the experiment. The 7 others were Confederates instructed by Asch to respond incorrectly. The Confederates responded incorrectly on 11 more occasions before the experiment was over. The question was how often the participant would forsake what he knew to be the correct answer and conform to the incorrect judgment given by everyone else. Here there was no ambiguity, as there was in Sharif's experiment. The right answer was clear. When participants in a control group made these judgments by themselves, with no social pressure, they almost never made a mistake. Solomon Asch, a pioneer of conformity research, Asch studied the effect of normative social influence. As Asch predicted, there was less conformity in his study than in Sharif's, but the rate of caving into the group was still surprisingly high. 3/4 of the participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer at least once. Overall, participants conformed on 1/3 of the critical trials. These results aren't simply surprising, they are disturbing as well. We like to think of people, ourselves especially, as sticking to what we think is right rather than following the herd. In addition, we worry about people abandoning the dictates of their own conscience to follow others into wrong-headed or potentially destructive behavior. Figure 9.4, Normative Social Influence. Participants in Ash's conformity study had a difficult time understanding why everyone appeared to be seeing things incorrectly. Even though it was clear to them what the right answer was, they ended up going along with the erroneous majority a third of the time. So you can see in the pictures, two different participants, or maybe the same one, whose head is tilted and his head is on his hand as he's trying to kind of understand what the participants are saying. Okay, so the test lines, you can see A is the shortest, B is clearly the longest, C is medium, and then there's a target line. So in this case, you can see it clearly matches B. There is undoubtedly some informational social influence discussed in the previous section at work in Ash's experiment. The incorrect judgments called out by the majority were for lines that were only 0.5 to 0.75 inch off the correct answer, so some participants may have questioned their own judgment and regarded the Confederates' responses as reliable sources of information. However, control participants who were not subject to social pressure got the answer right nearly 100% of the time, so there wasn't much uncertainty about the correct response. Thus, informational social influence was not the main cause of conformity. The primary reason people conformed was to avoid standing out negatively in the eyes of the group. Box 9.1, see page 278. Social psychologists refer to this kind of influence as normative social influence, the desire to avoid being criticized, disapproved of, or shunned. Normative social influence, the influence of other people that comes from the desire to avoid their disapproval and other social sanctions, ridicule, barbs, ostracism. People are often reluctant to depart from the norms of society, or at least the norms of the groups they care most about, because they fear the social consequences. The normative social pressures in Ash's experiment were sufficiently intense that the participants found themselves in a wrenching dilemma. Should I say what I truly think it is? But what would everyone else think if I gave a different response? They all agree, and they all seem so confident. Will they think I'm nuts? Will they interpret my disagreement as a slap in the face? But what kind of person am I if I go along with them? What should I do? To get an idea of the intensity of the participant's dilemma, imagine the following scenario. As part of a discussion of Ash's experiment, your social psychology professor shows an image of the target line and the 3 test lines and reports that although the right answer is line B, the Confederates all say it's C. As your professor begins to move on, one student raises his hand and announces with conviction, but the right answer is C. What would happen? Probably everyone would chuckle, making the charitable assumption that the student was trying to be funny. But if the student continued to insist that the Confederates' answer was correct, the chuckles would turn to awkward, nervous laughter, and everyone would turn toward the professor in an implicit plea to make this awkward situation go away. In subsequent lectures, people might avoid sitting by the nonconformist, and lunch invitations, dating opportunities, and offers to join a study group would likely diminish as well. Negative social repercussions like these are what Ash's participants likely felt they risked if they departed from the majority's response. Perhaps it's no surprise, then, that participants so often chose not to take the risk and conformed to the majority response. Box 9.1, Focus on Health, Bulimia and Social Influence. Why do so many young women engage in binge eating and then purging by vomiting or using laxatives? The phenomenon is relatively new. This sort of behavior, an eating disorder known as bulimia, was virtually unheard of until about 45 years ago. Has it become more common because the fashion industry and media have persuaded women to want to be thinner than is natural or healthy? See Chapter 10. Is it because body image and self-esteem have worsened? Such factors may play a role in the current epidemic of bulimia, but another factor is simple social influence. Christian Candle, 1988, studied sorority women at a large university and found that the more bulimic a woman's friends were, the more bulimic she was likely to be. As Crandall learned, this relationship wasn't because bulimic women discovered each other and became friends early in the school year, When the students had known one another for only a short time, there was no association between the level of a woman's bulimia and that of her friends, but over the course of the year, women in established friendship groups, not different newly formed groups, came to have similar levels of bulimia. Crandall studied 2 sororities and found 2 slightly different patterns of influence. In one sorority, women who differed in their level of bulimic activity from the average level in their sorority were less likely to be popular. Crandall inferred from this that there was an appropriate or normative level of bulimia in that sorority, and deviations from it in either direction were punished by rejection. In the other sorority, more binge eating, up to quite a large amount, was associated with more popularity. In that sorority, Crandall concluded, there was pressure toward considerable binge eating, and those most inclined to binge were rewarded with acceptance and popularity. The lesson, once again, is that social influence is everywhere, even influencing whether or not we're likely to suffer from chronic medical conditions. Thinness and social influence. When some members of a sorority engage in binge eating and purging to stay thin, pressures on other members of the sorority to do likewise can be intense. Factors affecting conformity pressure. Several generations of researchers have examined a number of variables that influence the tendency to conform. These include the characteristics of the group, the surrounding context, including cultural influences, and the task or issue at hand. See box 9.2 on page 280 for another determinant of people's readiness to conform. This research has provided a clearer understanding of when people are especially likely to conform and when they're less likely to do so. Both informational and normative social influences are powerful forces. As either one intensifies, so does the rate of conformity. The way to get along, I was told when I entered Congress, is to go along. John F. Kennedy.